September 18, 2015. Judy Schultz received a phone call from her 79-year-old mother, Ora Lea Hawkins. She knew something was wrong immediately after saying hello. Her mother was in tears, sobbing so hard she could barely make out what was said. Even the words she could recognize between whimpers didn't make sense. Something about going on a trip to Colorado with somebody named Rose? But that simply couldn't be. Judy knew her mom would never miss Christmas with the family or be away from her grandson for any length of time. It just didn't sound like the immovable family matriarch she knew and loved. Ora Lea wouldn't just decide to pack up and move, much less announce it over a tearful telephone call. It may not have sounded like her, but her mother was indeed on the other end of that line. The words came from her mouth, but they were not her own, and Mrs. Hawkins was not alone. Her arm was being twisted, perhaps even literally, by someone else that night. As her stomach sank in a titanic swell of fear and concern, Judy gathered herself and rushed out of the house. After making only a 2-minute drive, she arrived at her mother's home to find it dark and empty. After her non-productive knocking at the front door, Judy hurriedly returned to her car and called her sister, Amy Day. The 44-year-old was living with her mother, who had just been over to Judy's house about 8 hours earlier to have a talk with her elder daughter. Apparently, all was not well sharing her abode with her adult offspring, who had a reoccurring drug problem, unrelenting unemployment, and a sense of entitlement that would make even the most committed Karen appear contrite. After talking to Amy, her sister was more confused and worried than ever. She said she received the same concerning communication from her mom, but being almost 150 miles away at her boyfriend's, there was very little she could do. She sounded concerned, but was the heart of Amy Day really dark as night? This is the story of Ora Lea Hawkins, demented descendant turned defendant, and this is absolutely criminal. Before Amy Day became the matricidal menace she is today, she was once a respected member of the community. For many years, Amy was an executive assistant to the leaders of the Greater Orlando Aviation Authority, the governmental body that operates Orlando International Airport. In her role at the GOAA, she would often greet prominent political figures, even the president. Amy was flying high, unfortunately, in more ways than one. In 2009, Amy's bosses and coworkers began to notice erratic behavior that suggested she was heavily medicated. After 19 years of presumably sober service, her drugged-out displays were very out of character at that time. To keep her job, she'd have to submit to a drug test. Although the probe didn't reveal any illegal drugs, it could have shed light on her recent odd actions around the office. The GOAA accepted her resignation, and Amy accepted a severance check of just over $20,000. Bookmark your brain here for just a moment and buckle up, Buttercup. Because after this incident, Amy apparently went off the rails in a wild ride that would make Mr. Toad green with envy. She would descend ever more rapidly down a spiral of drugs, theft, and lies. All three of those factors were in play when it came to Amy's final act. Following her resignation in 2009, Amy traveled a rough road that still had occasional detours onto smoother streets. In 2010, she landed a job as a 911 dispatcher for the Osceola County Sheriff Department. A brief respite from a rocky reality was all Amy would get, however. On July 10th, she was loaded on pain and anxiety medications when she crashed her car. And that last bit's not a metaphor. According to the police report, after her single-party wreck, she told deputies in a slurred voice she only wanted to get a taco from down the street. She was arrested on a DUI charge, but in one of the few bright spots she had left, Amy managed to keep her job. Until 1 month later, when further downward she went. In August, she was arrested for DUI twice in as many days. The back-to-back busts were too much to overcome, and she was promptly let go from the sheriff department. Her problems began to compound themselves, having racked up 3 DUI drug charges and at least 2 lost jobs. Then, in 2011, she was sentenced for her trio of transgressions. Her DUI drug charges were downgraded to reckless driving, and she was sentenced to only 22 days in jail. That same year, she would also divorce from her husband. It was such a long fall in a very short time from just 2009 when she veered off of a career path and slammed headlong into a brick wall of consequences. And the sudden impact would end one life and shatter a family to shards. When Judy Schultz received the tearful phone call from her mother Friday night, it had been only hours since they were together in person. In the early afternoon of that day, Ora Lea Hawkins came over to Judy's house because she was having difficulties with her housemate. Amy had not only been living with, but off her elderly mother's fixed income. She had a history of drug abuse and addiction. But there was more. Ora Lea was concerned that Amy had stolen her coin collection, and she was growing more weary every day with arguments over household and other expenses. Judy was at a loss, racking her beleaguered brain to devise some kind of innocent explanations that agreed with the circumstances. She could find none. Saturday, September 19th, Judy Schultz tried to reach her mother, spending all night on the cell phone calling everyone she could think of. The pastor of her mother's church said his congregation had no Rose by any name. She wasn't at her boyfriend's house in Chiefland, which is a couple hours' drive from Mrs. Hawkins' home. While searching the home, Judy found her mother's driver's license and credit cards in a locked suitcase. She became increasingly worried and went with her sister to the Osceola County Sheriff Department to report her mother missing. Get ready, because you're about to go on another meandering day trip. On Monday, September 21st, Amy's vast web of lies had finally tangled and twisted around her own neck. Amy was arrested for her many inconsistencies when talking to the police. According to police documents, at the time where her mother theoretically needed her most, Amy was caught in one easily researchable lie after another. She initially said she last saw her mother on Saturday afternoon, but left for Gainesville to spend time with her boyfriend. When police called the phone number Amy had given them, the man who answered had never heard of Amy Day or her mother, Ora Hawkins. Later, they would manage to touch base with her real boyfriend, Carrie. But to call him Amy's boyfriend is, well, it's complicated. Here's what he had to say.
Amy referred to you as being her fiance.
Not true.
Not true at all?
Not true at all.
All right.
Me and Amy had a relationship, but it was always out on the table that we weren't exclusive or anything like that. Whenever she came over and whatnot, it was just, we were just friends.
Yeah. Okay. How do you know Amy?
We've been friends since back in my teen years.
Have you seen her within the last 2 weeks?
No.
No?
No.
When was the last time that you've seen Amy?
It's been well over a month ago.
Well over a month ago?
Yeah.
When was the last time you spoke with her?
So it would have been the 20th.
The 20th.
That was the last time I spoke to her. She called me. She was a little distressed and asked me if I would call law enforcement and tell them that I picked her up at 5 o'clock and dropped her off at 11:30, or she was going to be arrested.
Okay, when she told you this, what were you thinking?
I was thinking that she was having another DUI problem. I told her absolutely not.
All right, anything else that she said during that conversation?
She said that her mother was missing. And I asked her, why was she going to jail then? I said, unless you popped a cap in your mother, I said, they can't arrest you. You didn't do anything wrong. I said, let the cops do their job. I said, they'll find your mother. I'm sure she's okay.
When Amy came in for questioning, the experience was not so straightforward. We've seen much better liars in our day, but it's hard to match the sheer volume of whoppers she laid on the cops that day. The detectives were eating up every minute of it, happily feeding her more rope as needed. They let one lie sink in and become part of the narrative, effectively locking in her answer. Once she had boxed herself in, the investigators called her out on those lies.
My mother, I want her home.
I want her home too.
I want to go home right now and see her standing in the living room. That's what I want.
I want to bring her home.
I know.
What can you tell me about, there's been any recent purchases by your mom that you know of? Because there's some things that I need for you to help me explain and understand, okay?
I know she bought some stuff from Walmart.
Okay, do you know those things that she bought?
I know she bought a full-length mirror, TV.
Okay.
And because of the TV in her TV room is going out, and I think she bought some jewelry.
What credit card she used to pay for that one?
I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to guess Walmart.
Do you remember how much was the whole bill?
No, I didn't ask her.
On and on, the cycle repeated itself, and Amy kept talking. Here at Absolutely Criminal, we only have a Google law degree, but we've learned enough to know that cops rarely ask questions they don't already know the answers to. On the same day, authorities were back at Amy Day's house digging up evidence. When serving a search warrant of the house, the crime scene crew noticed something unusual about the garden. It appeared that there was a large area with fresh soil. As they get closer, however, they spotted something even more eye-catching. There were flowers popping up from the fresh dirt. But they were plastic flowers. When they removed the fake flora and dug up the loose soil, police discovered the scene was exactly what it looked like. Ora Lea Hawkins' body was buried in that shallow grave, wrapped in garbage bags, a pink blanket, a rope, and coaxial cable. In her closing arguments, Assistant State Attorney Sarah Hatch painted a clear picture for the jury as to the purpose of those items. As you'll see, the victim's body was wrapped first in garbage bags. Then over the top of the garbage bags, she's wrapped in pink blankets tied together with a rough rope and a long white coaxial cable. Now, this evidence is key because it interconnects again with the defendant's statements as to how the body was wrapped. Because what the defendant, if you recall, was asked in her interview with Detective Rios, at that point, she had been told that the body had been wrapped in garbage bags. That was the only information she had been told. It was buried and wrapped in trash bags. So when Detective Rios asked her, would your DNA be on the trash bags? She said, yes. You know, I've handled the trash bags before. He then asked her broader question. Is there, What else would your DNA be on? And what did she list out? Blankets, cable, and a rope. So the forensics team were certainly busy out in the field that day. But what about the digital forensic experts? They turned out to be even busier, as they uncovered even the most elusive ones and zeros from an array of devices. Of those gadgets, the most important one was Amy's phone. It betrayed her privacy everywhere she roamed and helped the detectives to trip her up multiple times. But even when confronted with the digital damnation, Amy held tight to her unwavering strategy. Deny, deny, deny. On September 22nd, detectives contacted Amy's childhood family friend, Melissa. She said she and Amy talked on Friday, the day before Ora Lea was last seen alive. Amy dropped a bombshell. Amy broke the news to her longtime pal that her mother died 3 months ago from a brain aneurysm. She said it was a peaceful passing, having died quietly in her sleep. And having not talked since April of that year, Amy went on to fill in her friend on what's taken place since then. Her father, Ed Hawkins, a retired sheriff's captain, was also dead, having succumbed to a massive heart attack about a month ago. Given how close the families were, it must have seemed odd to just be learning about this now. But people do grieve in their own way, after all. Besides, Melissa had no time to process any of that. She was still in shock learning Ora Lea and Ed, who treated her like their own daughter, were dead. It shivers the spine to think that at the time of that conversation, Amy's parents were known to be alive. In what seemed to Melissa a remarkable coincidence at the time, her own parents died about 2 months apart. Incredibly, her mother died of a brain aneurysm as well. If plagiarizing someone else's life story is a thing, Amy was doing just that. But the following fabrications were all Amy. She claimed to inherit $500,000 from her mom and $300,000 from her dad. Little orphan Amy was flush with cash and had a new lease on life. But she had something else, with which her bestie from back in the day was quite familiar. A recovering alcoholic herself, Melissa understood the substantial inner struggle it takes to overcome addiction. She'd been sober for several years and knew that someone can't be helped unless they want it. According to Melissa, anytime she would talk to Amy, she would be in varying degrees of intoxication. Sometimes she would be relatively coherent, but elsewhere on the sobriety spectrum were the occasions she slurred her words and was sometimes unintelligible. Because of this unpredictability, she had rescinded an offer she made to Amy much earlier that year. Melissa was a busy paralegal, and one time when they talked, she was buried in paperwork and needed help. It just so happened Amy was out of a job. What were the odds? Statistically, unlikely events happen all the time to individuals, but Amy seemed to be a living, breathing outlier. Amy had been planning to pack up and move in with her old friend at her home in Ohio. Melissa recognized the sure signs of active addiction and thought better of the arrangement.
So I had talked to her about her medication issues. I'm in recovery. I've been clean and sober for like 15 years, so I'm familiar with the whole disease. And I said, if you need help, there's people, resources. And she said she didn't have a problem. She just took too many when she gets stressed out. I just felt like that's a lot of pressure to take on another adult. I already have to take care of my daughter. And I'm like, I started thinking about it. I would be responsible for Amy too. And I thought trying to run my own business, do work for other attorneys, it might be too much for me. And I didn't I didn't want to ruin my friendship with her if I wasn't doing a good job taking care of her.
She broke the news in April, just months before Mom's murder. She made an excuse, and she thought Amy took it well. They didn't talk again until Amy rang her up in September. On that phone call, Amy effectively invited herself to spend a weekend some 800 miles away at Melissa's. Unlike in their previous conversation, Amy had no cash flow problems and booked the ticket while on the phone. Melissa would take off the weekend of September 21st, and they could spend some time catching up. What her friend didn't know is that the card Amy used to pay for her travel belonged to a very much alive Ora Lea. The airline ticket purchase wasn't the only expenditure Amy appropriated, or even the most expensive one. On the same day, she placed a $1,000 order at Walmart, including a 50-inch TV. Her mother was sure to notice this. What do you think? When Amy bought all that loot, had she already decided to kill her mother? Let us know below. And if you haven't already, please hit thumbs up, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss a thing. Speaking of missing a thing or two, back to our story. The autopsy was completed on Ora Lea Hawkins, and although it did not reveal the cause of her death, it did reveal a few details. The examination showed bruising over a large area of her body, plus smaller bruises on her mouth. Prosecutor Sarah Hatch argued Ora Lea had a hand placed over her mouth to keep her quiet, but there was no definitive evidence that she was suffocated or strangled. The defense attorney did his best to counteract her claims, hammering home the lack of physical evidence linking Amy to the murder.
The bottom line is they haven't proven by any direct evidence that Miss Day killed her mom. There's nothing in this record. All of the evidence, search high and low to find this proof. There's certainly no evidence of these other charges. The kidnapping and the abuse charge. This would require, I would submit, by the women and men of this jury, by you, that to find a conviction in this case will require you to skip over this fact, that there is no direct evidence that she did it.
After 4 days of testimony and just 2 hours later, the jury of 10 men and 2 women reached a verdict. Amy Day was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder of her own mother. In a letter that was read in court, her sister Judy wrote that it was beyond belief that her life was cut short through the callous actions of a relative, her daughter, my sister, Amy Day. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.